same time as this crisis, we try to seize on the opportunity with the Green Deal, with the Farm to Fork, with the Recovery Plan, with the EU Biodiversity Strategy, all these together, and this is what we're going to be talking about over these during this week, over these next 3 days, is how we're going to seize on this crisis as an opportunity. We want to rethink, retool the way we live, work, and eat as well. The Green Deal is to transform the EU to a climate-neutral continent by mid-century, resource-efficient and more competitive with more jobs. This is the moonshot moment, as the Commission President, Madame von der Leyen, has said, and we want to talk about this moonshot moment over the next 3 days. So, Green Week 2020 is entirely online. There are dozens of sessions on biodiversity, farming, forests, financing, water, soil, and fighting disease and air pollution. A lot to talk about. And there are the Life Awards for innovative projects. Who's making a difference out there across Europe? Plus partner events across Europe that you can also join in on. And take a look at your screen. You can see that there are ways to chat. You can send your questions in. So be sure of that. You can also look at different other events going on at the same time. There is hashtag EU Green Week. Remember, hashtag, where's that hashtag? There it is. Hashtag EU Green Week. Make sure you tweet like a beast. We were trending these last few events here, EU events in the last few weeks. Let's keep that up. Let's do that. And I might mention, next to me is Florijka Fink-Huya, welcome, who's the Director General of DG Environment at the European Commission. Welcome, Florijka. Welcome. But before we get to you, I'd like to get a message from the Commissioner, if that's all right with you, Florijka, from Virginijus Sinkevicius. He's going to give us a message. Can we roll that, please?
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Green Week. I was hoping to say those words to you in person back in June, but it was not to be. So I'm very happy to say them now, as we kick off the first virtual Green Week. We are centered in Brussels, but we feature guests and appearances from all around the Union. We are embracing the change. I can't promise there won't be any problems with connections, but we will do our best. And thank goodness we are here at last, talking about the issues that matter the most. We have called this opening session a new beginning. Many people who come to the Green Week are environmental experts, so they are all well aware of the urgent nature crisis. But as this is the opening session and our theme is nature and biodiversity, I'm going to start by being very explicit about the challenges we face. Then I want to talk about opportunities and the chance we have to shape a more sustainable future, not just for nature, but for everyone, because ultimately, we all depend on nature. We often hear phrases like once in a generation or once in a lifetime. But what we face with nature, as with climate, is actually more serious than that. These are the challenges of our epoch. The decisions we make, the choices of our generation will affect the world forever. I can't think of anything more serious than that. You have probably seen the latest figures, the WWF Living Planet report. They are impossible to ignore. Globally, they show that species, population sizes have declined by 69% since 1970. Yesterday, the latest State of Nature figures were published by the European Environment Agency, giving the picture in Europe. The European trends are not quite as bad as the global ones, but they are still completely unsustainable. They show that only 15% of our protected habitat types are in a good status. The overwhelming majority, 81%, are in a poor or bad conservation status, and at least a third of these show continued deterioration. For species protected under the Habitats Directive, around a quarter show a stable conservation status, but the vast majority, 63%, remain in a poor or bad conservation status. And of those in bad or poor status, only 6% of them are showing signs of recovery, while third continue to decline. That's the dark backdrop, but it's not the story. The story is how we turn things around, how we start to take better care of nature, how we create a future where nature thrives. That is why we have called the conference. We have brought some powerful tools. The new EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030 and its companion, Farm to Fork, are filled with promise. What they propose has the potential to halt biodiversity loss in Europe, to slow it around the globe, and transform our food systems and make them sustainable. They propose binding targets to restore damaged ecosystems and rivers, tools to improve the health of protected habitats and species, and to bring back pollinators to agricultural land. They are strategies to reduce pollution, green our cities, enhance organic and nature-friendly farming, and improve the health of forests. They also aim to protect and conserve biodiversity at sea, so the oceans continue to provide us with vital services. We need them now, like never before. Also because they have tremendous potential for growth and jobs, because they are good for our health and well-being. They are important elements in the EU recovery plan, as well as providing immediate business and investment opportunities to restore the EU economy. They will play a vital in building up the resilience of Europe's nature and protecting us from future pandemics. The actions for nature protection, sustainable use and restoration will bring a whole range of benefits to local communities, including economic benefits. The aim is to unlock funding for biodiversity worth 20 billion every year from EU funds, national and private funding. It's a strategy with commitments that are clear and measurable. If they are endorsed by the Council and the Parliament, their political weight will deliver genuine potential for transformative change. The story isn't finished. There are many adventures ahead, many hearts and minds to move. We understand the gravity of the challenge and the difficulties of this moment. 2020 was supposed to be nature's big year, our Paris moment for biodiversity. We need to keep that momentum going into next year as we rethink and rebuild our relationship to nature. We need nature and climate at the heart of recovery plans. The Green Week will help us do that. I want the discussions to be intense. The store of knowledge available at this conference has few equivalents anywhere else. Let's put it to good use and map out the paths to meeting these targets and deliver the changes the nature deserves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Keeping the momentum toward the Biodiversity Summit next year and keeping the momentum of the EU Green Deal, making sure it happens. Floika, if I may ask, you have only been Director General for a few weeks in the middle of all this. Quite a baptism of fire, right?
Yes, thank you, Chris, indeed. But I think the Commissioner already just laid out very clearly what we want to achieve with this Green Week, and therefore I would like to also use the occasion to say welcome to everybody that's listening and joining us over the next couple of days. And I'm very proud and it's a real pleasure to do so as the new Director General. Can I just say something? Because
Sure.
We both are the only ones now physically in the studio with social distancing, of course.
In a
preserved.
massive auditorium here,
but
safe.
But if I may, well, social distancing is observed. But what I wanted to say, going virtual has, of course, certain advantages. And I really hope that our Green Week will be picked up even by more citizens, even actually journalists. And I really count on you to help us doing the advocacy on our theme, A New Beginning for People and Nature.
Now, how can Green Week, how can this week, these 3 days of intense talks among policymakers, NGOs, scientists, private sector, and we're going to have a panel discussion momentarily, kind of integrating all those, how can that help to energize the Green Deal?
Well, I hope it really puts, as the Commissioner has said, biodiversity at the center of all our talks. And that's exactly what we need now, to take biodiversity loss serious. if we go out after these 3 days, and as I just said, citizen, journalists, experts, help us advocate and make this a central moment, then I think we have already achieved quite a lot.
And in fact, this first panel that we're about to start with you in it includes 2 biodiversity NGOs, one for the birds and one for the pollinators, birds and the bees. They're with us at the very start. That does set the tone about biodiversity from the very beginning, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. But I think it also has to come out how much investment in these nature-based services, I mean, in nature, will also be important for the recovery, but also will be important for job creation and economy.
Indeed, recovery. I mean, how can we have biodiversity help society and the economy in the post-pandemic world? How can we seize on this as an opportunity and as a necessary way to recover the right way, building back better, right?
Not only, but you know that the Green Deal for us is the growth path for the recovery. We are still in the discussions on finalizing the MFF and the funds that go with it, but it will allow us to go and use, unfortunately, the crisis, but to use it to come out in, let's say, with a transformative agenda, and their biodiversity will be key, so that we also go for future-proofing and go for nature-based investments. That's basically the most important for us.
So from these 3 days, what would you like to see play out from these 3 days? Because there will be a lot of opposing viewpoints, right? This is taking everything on. Even as the Parliament is voting on the different long-term budgets and farming policies and all of that, this week is an intense exchange of views. What would you like to see at the end of this Green Week that will make your job easier, make your baptism of fire a bit less fiery?
Well, as I said, to bring biodiversity into the center of our discussion, into the center also of our discussion on investment, on the recovery, take it out of what might have been perceived so far as a niche. It is, when you look at how much of the global's GDP is actually linked to nature-based services or nature investments, it's enormous. I mean, just as I said, I don't know, I have to repeat that.
No, you don't have to.
Half of the GDP. That's enormous.
But that's it. It's true. That is why we are so joined at the hip with nature, and the economy is as well. But this is also a responsibility, isn't it? I mean, if I may, you were in Berlin when, you saw the Berlin Wall fall. You went to the Freie Universität Berlin. That's where you studied, right?
In Chile, yes.
Now, that was the moment when people thought about Europe reunifying, coming back together, which was a great thing, but it also means a lot of responsibility, doesn't it? And that the European Union and Europe needs to take on that responsibility globally when it comes to ensuring biodiversity, as we did in Paris for the climate agreement. And this summit on biodiversity in China next year is going to need the European support for it to happen, won't it?
Yes, we have the ambition to be a standard setter, but we can't do it alone. So first of all, at home, we have to practice what we preach, right? We have to walk the talk.
Yeah.
And the Commissioner just said it. I mean, we have put out strategies like Farm to Fork and Biodiversity Strategy, but we now have to make sure that the Council and the Parliament, so our 2 decision-making bodies, will accept it, translate it, and then you already put the question about the green recovery, the transformative agenda hopefully after COVID or during COVID, here to make nature-based solutions also a central part of the recovery. This will be our challenge, and for that we need to explain, and this week hopefully helps explain, and I count on the others to multiply our explanations and your concerns to the decision makers. We are proposing, the Commission is not a decision maker, right? So that's where we can show the way, but others have to pick it up and then translate it.
Well, thank you, Florica. We'll come back and talk a bit more, but let's pull in the rest of the panel. which, as I mentioned, includes policymakers and also scientists, the European Environment Agency, the two NGOs, and Danone, which is a major food, as you well know, major food producer. Can we begin that panel now with, can we put those up on the screen, the different participants? I would like to begin with Hans Buynings, Executive Director of the European Environment Agency. Hans, we spoke even in recent days about this, about the urgency. How do you say, you say this is a last chance for a new beginning, and how are you playing a part in getting that message across?
Well, first of all, by putting the facts on the table, because Europe is a continent where we make fact-based and knowledge-based policies. And I think for biodiversity, we now understand that there is a parallel with climate change. This is the pivotal decade, and the two are interconnected on top of that. So if we look at where the trends are, and I will launch the State of Nature report later on today, the trends are not positive, as the Commissioner also said. And what is concerning, of course, is that this is after 20 years of promising halting biodiversity loss. And in 2010, when it should have happened, we said, you know, it didn't happen, we'll do it by 2020. Well, I can tell you, it hasn't happened. So that points in the direction of more fundamental taking up of biodiversity in everything we do, and that is exactly also what Florica has put on the table. It is center stage when we think of a society for the future. And if we think of in terms of capital, people think in financial capital and maybe social capital, but it's clear by now that natural capital is actually the foundational capital on which we build healthy societies, for which we need an enabling economy. And too often we turn that upside down. You know, we have an economy that literally draws on society and draws on that natural capital. So understanding the order of things here in the long term, I think, is absolutely necessary. And luckily, as a knowledge player, together with other knowledge players in Europe, the JRC, the European Topic Center for Biodiversity researchers, we understand better what the issues are. We understand better how they all hang together, and we understand better how to deal with these issues. And I'm optimistic to the extent that this has landed to a large extent and with high ambitions in the biodiversity strategy. And so what we plan to do as an agency is to be in full support of this high ambitions for the European level and the member state level, and make sure that we have the right data to monitor whether we are indeed bending the trend and turning the curve towards a sustainable management, an ecosystem-based management of our most foundational capital.
Hans, I know you provide the science, but I'm sure you can suggest what needs to be done. And you did touch on the question of capital, and we're going to be talking about investment as well in these next 3 days. That a very shocking figure that I saw just in the last few days, the OECD, they had a report this year saying that the world is spending 5 times as much on hurting biodiversity than it is helping it. So what do you think about that, and what needs to be done?
Well, yeah, and we know where the pressures are coming from. I mean, the pressures are coming from agriculture, from landscape fragmentation, from poor land use practices, from pollution, and yes, we keep investing in that. And so the fundamental mainstreaming, not as a side issue, something in the margins, a green layer on top of something, but fundamentally doing that will steer the investments in these critical sectors of the economy in another direction. That is one thing. The other thing is, of course, that if you think of climate change, I think by now everybody can think of an investment portfolio that deals with climate change mitigation and even adaptation. It's much more difficult to do that when you think of biodiversity and ecosystems. And I think we've got a serious task of really making it explicit what type of investments are required and how we can link public investments as a leverage to also bring private investments to the table. Nature-based solutions are a fantastic example of that. They don't fall from the sky. They require investments, they require planning, they require sustained commitment by those involved. And if we can translate that and connect it then to climate change, nature-based solutions also in support of mitigation and adaptation, then we are really making steps forward. So I think bringing the knowledge to the table in a convincing way to those who set the agenda, make the political choices, and then also those who bring the money to the table is critical.
Indeed, indeed. Strengthens the hand of the argument. Hans, let me move on to Patricia Zurita, the Chief Executive of BirdLife. That's a global partnership of conservation organizations that strive to conserve birds, their habitats, and biodiversity. You got 2.7 million members, Patricia, and tell us, speaking for them, what, in your mind, did COVID teach us about the importance of the Green Deal and pushing that forward?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you, opening up the Green Week, and hopefully really kicking off for sure this new beginning. For those of you who don't know BirdLife, we are a family of 115 organizations around the world. We don't only work on birds, we use birds as the best ambassadors for nature. They tell us what's happening with the planet. And I can not only but re-emphasize what Florica and the commissioner said, and also thank Hans for the great work with the report that is going to be launched today. I think the COVID pandemic is a shock that has come to humanity, and hopefully we are really waking up from this to realize that we have to restore the relationship that we have with nature. I mean, you heard it from Florica. The World Economic Forum provided a report just in June saying that half of the GDP is dependent on nature. Our survival is depending on nature. We're seeing it. Our health depends on nature. Meanwhile, we are putting 5 times the amounts of subsidies on destroying nature than on investing in nature. And a report that just came out from the Paulson Institute and the Nature Conservancy about 2 weeks ago said the gap for investing in nature, in biodiversity and nature, is about 700 billion US dollars in the next 10 years. Now, the good news is that the money is on the table. We just need to reallocate these harmful subsidies that are destroying our nature, that are destroying our planet, to make sure that we're investing on what is the mere foundation of all of our work. I mean, you heard it from Hans, we depend on nature. So why are we not making the right decisions? And I was incredibly shocked to hear that the vote that is going to happen precisely today about the Common Agricultural Policy is actually dismantling the proposal from the Commission to make sure that we're protecting those very lands and that we're restoring those lands that are harming our nature, and ensuring that we can reignite our economies, provide incentives to local people so they can restore nature and make us all healthy. I mean, if we don't learn from this pandemic, and we don't learn that we are living this because we are not protecting nature, then I don't know what is going to make us learn. And I am incredibly concerned because on one hand, we have the extraordinary leadership that we have seen from the Commission. And Florica, you and your team, your predecessor and the Commissioner have been pushing for the biodiversity strategy and for the farm to fork strategy. And they are, as the Commissioner just said, filled with incredible promise. But unless we walk that talk and we really fulfill that promise with measures that are going to fund those strategies and that are going to help us make sure that those ambitious targets that the planet really needs, is not only about Europe. You guys are setting up the ambition of the rest of the planet at an incredibly important time. But if we don't put the money behind it, and we're just putting around really wonderful promises without really the money behind it and the decisions, and really taking those bold decisions like what has to happen tonight at the vote at the Parliament for the CAP reform, and we ensure that we are not dismantling all of these wonderful schemes to really bring nature to farmlands, then it doesn't really matter how big the ambition is. We will continue to fail as we have been reporting how we failed with the Aichi targets.
Okay, Patricia, those are all great ideas, but how do you get, and this is part of the exercise these next 3 days, how do you get the public behind you, the public to support clean technologies, for instance, so that they don't necessarily have to think that they're a luxury. They can actually save us money and save the planet at the same time.
Well, I think the public is with us. I think the public is already coming and saying, we need to make these changes. What we need to do is make sure that we are showcasing and scaling up the examples that have already worked. Look, Europe has been a leader on this. Let's think about renewable energy for just 1 minute. 10 years ago, the European Union decided to invest in renewable energy as a bet. As you know, as Florica said, as a standard setter. And now a lot of the movement has come behind because it's actually proving that it's not only viable, people want it, it's cheaper, and it's getting us less pollution and controlling or reducing our impact on climate change. So it is about making that policy change that ignites that relationship with the private sector, incentivizes the right things, and then the whole movement happens. The people are with us, and you should see the storm of messages that we're receiving today because of the threat of dismantling the CAP amendments that we were proposing and the Commission was proposing. Can
we talk birds 1 sec? Can you give me one example of maybe where it's working, where we're able to protect an ecosystem for birds? Can you give us one example of that?
Many of them, and then that's the wonder of nature. The minute that you actually give nature a chance, it actually comes back. So let's think about the eradication of invasive species, for example. The minute that you take invasive species that were not supposed to be in that ecosystem out, and think about not only Europe, but also the islands in the Pacific or the Mediterranean or the Caribbean, the minute that you take those invasive species out, the nature comes back, birds come back. We are working directly with another example, fisheries, the fishing sector, making sure that there's no bycatch, so fishermen can have the right amount of fish, and they don't get birds hooked into their lines. We have worked with fisheries around the world, and in 10 countries, pushing the regulation, and we have reduced bycatch of albatrosses and petrels over 90%. I mean, it is possible, and populations are coming back. The wonderful thing, and I will point to the report that we just put out, the State of the World Birds 2 weeks ago. While we have failed miserably in achieving all of the Aichi targets, we have extraordinary examples when conservation actually works. We just need to make more of that. Yeah. Make sure that people are having the incentives to make it happen, and just scale it up so we can actually turn nature to support us. Nature is incredibly generous. When we give it a chance, it actually comes back.
Nadine Schule, let me move to you, founder of Pollinator Ambassadors. Your nature-based workshops, you do those on business development, team building, leadership, sustainable beekeeping. And you're a quite youthful organization as well. So my question would be, what's the role of youth in making the Green Deal happen? We've seen this youth wave, almost a youth quake globally, you know, with Greta Thunberg and many others like yourself. So what is the role of youth in the Green Deal?
Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. And I'd like to start by saying that this new beginning that we're going to talk about this week has already come. You just asked, Patricia, how can we get the citizens on board? Right. And when I did my research for the panel, I heard Patricia say in a conference 2 years ago that we need to get these regular people on board to make a movement. And I'm here to tell you, we are here. We are doing our work. We already drive a positive impact from.
Oh.
Of course.
Okay, is that?
Can you hear me?
I hear you now. It's frozen a couple moments. Let's try to continue this if we can. Okay, we might have to come back. Okay. All right. Okay, Nadine, we'll come back to you if you can hear me. We'll come back to you.
I think she's on now.
Okay.
Back on? Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, you can continue.
All right.
Let's try it.
Let's hope the technology supports us now.
Indeed.
So it's not only Greta was about to say, it's food saving, it's the zero waste movement. We change the way that we eat, we change the way that we travel, the list goes on. And compared to the 100 corporations, which cause 71% of global emissions, our efforts feel close to meaningless and the time is running out. So we are not the policymakers and the decision makers and the CEOs yet, but we have common sense and our own experiences, and that's enough to be worried. So we as youth, because you ask which role we have, we bring in open-mindedness, the creativity, bold perspectives, and these are needed for this radical change that we need. But our commitment also comes with two expectations, which are not very high. Just quickly, the first one is, of course, as it was mentioned before, this major shift of resources, redistribution of resources. We're talking about a social issue here. We are ready to commit our lives to nature regeneration, but the payment and the funding to do so are missing. We're trying our best, but we cannot scale up, neither in the green sector nor in the social sector. This is a social question. So we really need to think about how we can change that. And there are solutions on the table, obviously. The second expectation, I'd say, is keeping in mind that every generation is borrowing the planet from future generations, right? So
Okay.
I hope you can hear me.
You're back. Go ahead.
Okay. We don't want to inherit multiple crises. It's the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, and just starting economic crisis, a pandemic. These things are not only scary, they're life-threatening. And so we need to really complement each other and not compete with each other, because I want to believe that everybody here on this panel and beyond has really the same goal. So I'm asking you to imagine a Europe in which we don't have to decide between natural and financial sustainability, but a Europe in which people can wholeheartedly dedicate their lives to nature protection and nature regeneration. So I'm really looking forward to finding some answers with you this week and of course also beyond.
Nadine, you told me before today that as an activist and beekeeper and entrepreneur that you are worried. Why are you so worried?
Well, I'm not the policy expert here, obviously, but I have heard of the Rio Conventions, 1992. I have seen many of these promises that have been made in the not just last years, but last decades. So I would like to have the trust that these things that are being talked about are put into practice, are made a reality. And as I said, we are running out of time. So that's what makes me worried. And I don't want to be worried. I would like to be youthful. I don't want to feel like having to be the adult on the table or at the table all the time. So let's really work on this together. We're ready to work on it. Okay. So let's do that.
Okay. Thanks. Let me move on to Matthias Wischera, Secretary General of Danone. As most of you know, it's a European multinational food company. In 2018, Danone sold products in 120 markets with sales of about 25 billion euros. Obviously, an industry leader. And what sort of leadership could we see in Danone that perhaps could move the rest of the food business in the right direction? Matthias, food sovereignty, for instance, EU producing at home, how can that promote the Green Deal?
Thank you. Hi, Chris. Hi, everyone. First of all, I wanted to highlight what has been said by my CEO a few months ago. The food system is broken. The food system is broken because of the fact we have something like 30% of soils that are depleted. The food system is broken because of the intensive agriculture that has been done for decades. And this is the reason why we need to move the needle and to change the system. And when you speak about food sovereignty, this is a very, very important topic. During the COVID crisis, we spoke a lot about health sovereignty, but less about food sovereignty. And food sovereignty is not protectionism, it's not autarky, it is the fact to have the capacity to promote more local food production and to control the food supply chain. This is really, really instrumental. This is instrumental at the country level, but also at the European level. One example that is really, really important, Europe imports 75% of its vegetable protein supply, mainly from Brazil, Argentina, and the US. This is a strong weakness. This is a strong weakness. And we depend on 7 plants for 70% of our global consumption, when we know that there are existing 6,000 plants. There is a systemic risk. To tackle this challenge, we do think, Danone with other companies, with NGOs, that to promote the right food sovereignty policy, we need to have a more sustainable food supply chains. This is really critical. And we do think, again, that intensive agriculture is not the right solution. We need to promote what we call regenerative agriculture to protect soil health, to protect animal welfare, and to promote biodiversity for plants and for agriculture. And this is the reason why we want to stick to the green recovery. We are very happy as a company to have the Farm to Fork strategy, the Green Deal, and we want to stick to this policy, which is not a burden, again, because green recovery is not an option. And we do think that there is a huge opportunity for businesses to stick to such a policy. And I want just to give you an example for Danone about food sovereignty. In Normandy, in France, we don't want to depend on soy from other countries like Brazil, and this is the reason why we have experienced with 70 hectares to grow soy for the cattle in Normandy. And this is just the beginning, and we need to go further, because food sovereignty is really key in this new world.
Matthias, how is Danone encouraging its suppliers to be greener? That it's not just good corporate social responsibility, it's not just good CSR, it's actually a profitable way of doing business in the long run, isn't it?
Yeah, you're right. When it comes to carbon emissions, it's really important to have an ecosystem approach, and not only inside the companies. This is the reason why we are working with all suppliers, all customers, also to have the right policy when it comes to social and environmental impact. The business model of Danone is One Planet, One Health, and we want to stick to this strategy. And the purpose of the company is bringing health through food to as many people as possible. And 90% of our portfolio is healthy. Then to stick to this global strategy, we need to encourage our suppliers to be greener and to be more sustainable. And what we do, for instance, in France, we want to have 100% of our farmers, we have more than 2,000 farmers in France working with Danone, to have 100% of our farmers being in a regenerative agriculture approach practices by 2025. Then we invested, we invested 50 million euros for that, and we want to have pilot projects in other countries, not only in France, to promote soil preservation, to promote biodiversity, to promote the reduction of phytosanitary products, and to promote protein self-sufficiency. This is really key. The transition towards regenerative agriculture is really key, and we need to finance it because this takes something like 2 years to have regenerative agriculture practices if you come from an intensive approach, and we need to find the right way to finance it. It could be through multinationals like Danone, it could be through European Health, it could be through also banks, and we need to frame the right system for that. Transition is key.
Now, Matthias, is that one of the items in your call to action? You have an EU call to action by Danone. Is that part of it?
Yeah, it's totally part of it. We wanted to, we launched a few months ago a European call to action to say that a common agricultural policy is not enough. At the European stage, we should have a common food policy, which includes health challenges, which includes other topics that only agriculture. And this is the reason why we wanted to launch such a call to action with different proposals and with different streams. First, we wanted to leverage agriculture as a solution to tackle climate change. Hans spoke about that, and this is really key because the global emissions from agriculture are the same as the ones from industry. Then this is really, really critical to have agriculture as a tool to tackle climate change and to restore biodiversity. And for instance, we want to promote sequestration of carbon in soils, which is a very strong solution to tackle climate change. Another example, and the last one, to have a common food policy is to have the right way to promote healthier choices for consumers. And for instance, we are in favor of having Nutri-Score as a label to be mandatory in every European country, because this is a very scientific-based label that is really important. And we have such a call to action to promote a common food policy.
Because, you know, I've spoken with other sectors as well in the private sector, and sometimes you do have to have sort of a common set of rules or practices set for it to be worthwhile for all the companies to act. Because if one acts by itself, it might be put at a disadvantage, right? So maybe that's where a common EU policy would help there, wouldn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And this is the reason why we have a strong relationship with all the European ecosystem. We had a meeting with the commissioner a few days ago, and we wanted also to grow, to build coalitions with other companies. And for instance, 1 year ago at the last UNGA, we have launched OP2B, One Planet Business for Biodiversity, even with competitors like Mars, Nestle, Unilever, to tackle the loss of biodiversity when it comes to agri-based activities. And this is really key. Even a multinational like Danone, if we are in a standalone position, we are useless. It's useless. We cannot, because the challenge is so high that we need to be in a collective mode. And we need to have, on the one side, the right connection with the global European ecosystem, which is really key. And we do believe that the European Green Deal is really instrumental, and we want to stick to that. And also to have a collective approach with coalitions. And again, OP2B, One Planet Business for Biodiversity, is, we do know, we are sure about that, the right way to tackle in a collective way the loss of biodiversity.
We've got some questions coming in, and please send in more, please. You can see on the screen where you can, I think it's toward the bottom right, there's a place you can click with a question mark, and you can put in your, like a chat message. We've got a few here already. What choice, here's one to whoever wants to answer this, what choice is there when the fairy tale of constant economic growth is the ethos which underlies the new beginning promoted by EU Green Week? Would someone, Florica, what do you think?
I would like to actually come back. I mean, I tried to answer that question, but it's linked also to investment, right? It's ethos, yes, but let's face it, we are in a crisis. I'm very pragmatic. I know that I need to get, the citizen on the street with us to say, yes, it's something in for me as well.
Indeed.
If I have lost my job or, lose my livelihood. As it was said before, there is money. There's money available. The question is, how is it put up? Now, we have in the biodiversity strategy, for instance, said we would like to unlock 80 billion per year. And this is not, let's say, something which is just made up. It is based on assessment by member states. And we think this is with all the different funds that we have available, this can be reached. Now, the question is, do they really then go with the national plans, or, as it was said, under the Cohesion Fund or under the Agriculture Fund, into the right investment, right? And the Commission has set out, especially now under the Recover and Resilience Fund, which hopefully will be coming now, quite clear guidance. And nobody has so far mentioned the do no harm or do no significant harm principle. This is something that should really guide our investments, or also the vetting of investment. I'm less concerned, to be quite honest, about private capital, because they are seeing it and they are seeing opportunities and they will be first movers and they're going into that. But I'm more concerned if I look at public investments, because especially now in the recovery or in the crisis, people might tend to say we go for the classics because it's easy, we do know, although we know from the European semester where we have gaps, also including on the environmental side. So I'm making a little bit an appeal, because the national recovery and resilience plans will have to be put up also for a consultation, a public consultation. So this is also a way to influence
input,
and to put input, because it should go not only, but it should also at least go into, of course, clean energy, but waste and water management, in investing in wetlands, peatlands, in forest, in organic farming, in circularity. Circular economy is really a growth model. And Europe could be a little bit there as a first mover. But these things has to be also put into the plans. We, as I said, give guidance. Also as a DG, we have given guidance. The Commission is giving guidance, but it needs to be picked up, right?
And this question, though, that of economic growth. Investment is very important, but economic growth up to now has been, measured by gross domestic product, how much more stuff we're making. And that is a question that the EU is examining, isn't it, on how to measure economic performance, isn't it?
As I said, we also should look at, we have already the taxonomy, as we said, what would be, green investments.
Right.
We are going for what we call delegated acts. Now it sounds very technical, but it will clarify if you go, for instance, in farming, if you go in steel, if you go in steel production, aluminium production, in construction products, what would be a green way of investment and working. So this is coming. Do no harm is difficult to measure, but it can be measured, and we have, even for biodiversity, we have real markers. So we have to think long-term partly as well.
Hans.
Chris.
Yes, go ahead, Hans.
Yes, I'd like to pick up on this question, because I think it's, of course, a very fundamental question. And I'd like to pick it up where Florica left the discussion on, we measure the economy, only on GDP, but actually we do have other measurements. On the social side, we do have good indicators. Europe has indicators on poverty. We have indicators on distribution, income distribution. The Gini coefficient is for me a very important measurement of how a society is doing. And actually, on the side of natural capital, we have the methodology and we have applied it. It's natural capital accounting. It's the work that is done under MAS, measuring and assessing ecosystems and their services. The problem is that those things are often not mandatory. So countries don't have to do them on an annual basis. They do not have to be reported, and they don't feature in important debates as much. Let's assume that we would look at countries and say, I take France. The French economy grew by 2.4%. Its inequality remained stable, but its natural capital declined by 1.4%. Let's assume that we would make these statements. Then we would have a rather different debate about whether that 2.4% economic growth is a good thing or not, and whether that should become a different type of growth. And that's where I think the fundamental question on the economy comes in. There's this saying that if one believes that unlimited growth on a finite planet is possible, you have to be an economist or a fool. By now, a lot of economists have moved on. But I think there is something to it. We can think of an economy that adds value, that generates well-being, that thinks about distributional issues more fundamentally as a successful economy, and one that is not only aiming to see one indicator of the economy go upwards. And I think quite a bit of what Matthias brought to the table about regenerative agriculture can be extended to this idea of an economy that is capable of generating well-being and generating it within planetary boundaries, but also within social boundaries, within distribution. And I think that is an indication that is stronger and stronger, and where I think if you want to read positive signals into the Green Deal, a lot of the seeds to have that type of discussion are actually present in the European Green Deal. So let's plant those seeds, nurture them, and then reap the benefits from changing the discussion. That would be my call here.
Patricia, perhaps, excuse the pun, but you could maybe give us a bird's eye view of this idea of growth too, because you were talking about how we are in this fork in the road, right? In rethinking the economy, how we live and work and eat, and how do you see that according to that question about growth?
Well, I'm going to say I'm an economist, but I think, like Hans said, I think many of us have actually identified that it is not only about GDP. We are really at a fork in the road, and we have the opportunity and the unique, and I want in a lifetime opportunity to choose to change our model and acknowledge that nature is really at the heart of everything that we do. I mean, you heard it. Half of our GDP depends on nature. How is it that we are not seeing it?
Indeed.
Or the other option, business as usual, and we keep depleting our nature and getting ourselves in a situation where we are right now. The reason we are leaving this pandemic is because we have absolutely abused nature. If we want to be healthy, we need a healthy environment. And this is one of the reasons why BirdLife and other 800 and more organizations are advocating to ensure that the right to a healthy environment becomes a universal human right. We need to make sure that we can build up better by getting nature at the heart of it. And you know, the interesting thing of this is that when we invest in nature and nature and environmentally friendly solutions, those are sustainable, those are fair, those are long-lasting, and they generate a real economic income and value. If you look back to the 2008 economic crisis, those projects that were invested on green infrastructure, on environmental restoration, on nature protection, those were the ones that had the greatest rate of return, that had the most fair distribution of income amongst the communities that were implementing them, and that were the most long-lasting of all of the investments. So do we really want to learn? Again, human beings, we have to look back and learn from the lessons that we have been seeing. You want to learn and go and build up a much better and sustainable future, or do we want to go back into the traditional subsidies and, you know, approve the cap the way that is being promoted today, or really take a bold decision and make a change not only for us, but for our future and for our well-being? Do we want to live more pandemics like the ones that we are living right now, or do we want to be healthy and be having a healthy environment that is not only good natural capital, but the fair thing to do for the young people and for people like Nadine, that we don't want to leave a world full of crisis?
Patricia, I heard a number of hashtag Green Weeks in there, a whole bunch of them in there, and I hope some people can tweet about that. Keep nature at the heart of economic growth is that fork in the road, right? Let's move on to another question. Nadia in Rixenzout, that's just outside of Brussels, says this is called A New Beginning. That's the name of our Green Week. Why should we believe leaders when they say it will be different this time? Why should we believe leaders about that, Floika?
Well, I'm an optimist. And I do think it is a bit different than a few years ago because of the youth, because of the Friday for Futures, because even on Netflix you have C. Attenborough. I mean, people do now listen, and I think the politicians feel the heat as well. I mean, there is more knowledge. There's more knowledge also thanks to Hans and other agencies. about the devastated effect and the long-term effect. So I do think, even though new beginning, yes, we have no other choice, right? I mean, we have to.
Yeah.
But it is, I see it. I heard also the concerns about questions on in the council about agriculture, the discussions. But at the same time, we had the Leaders' Pledge now in New York, an overwhelming amount of countries pledging in view of Kunming next year to support nature-based solutions and to go and invest in biodiversity. So why would we hamper them? We should encourage them to go further.
Well, and let me ask on the corporate side, Matthias, you know, some people can so easily say, well, this is just more effort at greenwashing. These are just big companies trying to make themselves look good. Is this really different this time, Matthias?
Yes, I do think so. I'm thinking I'm not naive because first, this is a consumer-centric approach. There is a food revolution and a food generation that want to change their habits. And if you want to stick to consumers' habits, you need to change the system, the food system, and you need to change your sustainable policy. And I think that first, this is not only for good, this is for good business. Secondly, again, this is not an option because when we were speaking about soils, about soil health, 30% of soils are depleted. It's no more sustainable. If we do continue that way, we won't be able to feed all the people in the 30 coming years. Then it's not an option now. And thirdly, I think there is also a competitive approach of changing the system at the European level. Because if we compare with other countries, with other parts of the world, Europe could have the strong assets for biodiversity, for the Green Deal, to have the strong and competitive asset. And this is also, again, something that has to do with business and not only with for good approach or a philanthropy approach for a better world. I think this is a strong business request.
Let me thank you, Matthias. I might mention to those watching, I'm told from the technical side that there are people asking questions in the chat section but not submitting them to Meet You, right? That's the platform where you're supposed to send in the questions to Meet You. So please do send those in because it's very important that we get all those questions. There are a lot of them out there that we're not seeing. Here's one from Jessica Micklem. You might want to listen up, Nadine. I got this one for you. Since Europe is increasingly becoming a society skewed toward older generations, how can we ensure decision makers and politicians give more weight to the needs of the young and future generations when these are not their biggest voters? They will be.
Oh, but they will.
Nadine,
I
what do you
didn't get the vocabulary in the beginning. How can we?
Yeah, that went by
Could you
pretty
repeat
fast.
that?
Sorry. The idea is that according to this question, that you know the politics is leaning more toward the older voters because I guess there are more of them at the moment, but and less toward the younger voters and future generations who aren't voting yet. Is that politics skewed in that direction, or what gives you hope that it's not?
Well, the hope that I have is time. I'm experiencing now as this young generation what it means to live through multiple crises. So one day when, I don't know, I will be in a decision-making position on all these other people that go through that frustration right now as well, we hope to act differently in positions of power and to listen to youth. I think there are already good steps. So for example, some EU countries have lowered their voting age so that more young people's voices are considered in their politics. But other than that, to be honest, I work on keeping my hopes up every day. It's a personal work. So it's difficult to not be worried, knowing all the data that are out there.
Yeah, indeed. I've read and seen about the virtual collapse of bee populations in different parts of the world. Can you give us a hopeful story about how that might be improving in somewhere, or is there mainly despair on your part?
Well, not only, of course. The co-founder of Pollinate Ambassadors, Nink, and I, we worked the whole year and even before that to see how we can work together with the bees in a way that not only we thrive, but also they thrive. So as a beekeeper, I have a reciprocal relationship with the bees. I don't exploit them, and I don't expect them to continue their growth. I don't need my bees to be competitive, but collaborative. And I think that's a major difference of that generation, and that's just really growing as a movement to collaborate. So I realized how important the community is. There are not a lot of businesses or NGOs using social biomimicry, so that methodology of looking at nature and seeing what we can learn from it as an organization. There are not a lot of these out there, but those who are, we are not competing against them. We're calling them, we're writing them email, and we say, hey, cool, you work on the same thing. Let's do something together, and how can we learn from each other? And that's something that actually gives me great hope.
That is indeed hopeful. Gunther in Bochum in Germany says these top-level declarations are all very ambitious, but what does it mean on the ground? How do you convince a German land or region to take more notice of biodiversity? Or the mayor in a small town? Sometimes it's a tough call. Who would like to answer that? Anybody?
Can I jump in?
Just go ahead.
So let's take a mayor in the middle of Germany or anywhere in Europe or anywhere in the world, and let's look into a small town that has a green environment, greenery around them, versus a town that is completely built up and has completely lost their greenery. And I think this is one of the lessons that we're learning from the pandemic. You know, I was just listening a couple of weeks ago, the BBC was saying how much Londoners are actually listening to the birds because there's not so much traffic, because there's not so much noise, because there's not so much pollution. And our connectivity to nature and how that actually impacts our not only our physical health, but our mental health. And then think about, as a mayor, what do you want out of your people? Do you want your people to be able to go around and be able to enjoy the city and feel at home because you have all these green spaces, because you're seeing birds flying, because you're seeing, the environment really healthy? Or do you want your people to be incredibly sad and depressed and have to invest a lot more money on mental health and physical health facilities because they don't have the opportunity of enjoying nature? I mean, this is what we are not remembering, and we're not acknowledging that nature is not a luxury. Nature is the base of our survival. And unless we actually realize that we have to put it at the heart of the solution, and I will keep saying this, it's not only a Green Week hashtag, this is the mantra of the green recovery. Nature has to be at the heart of the solution. If we don't make it happen that way, we are not going to be healthy.
But how much more can we raise consciousness among even voters to call on their leaders to take more action? Hans.
But if I may, of course, what Patricia says is correct, and I think, yes, a lot of people know that now, but that's where governance comes in. That's where policies matter. We see that where there are binding policies with clear targets and where we shift financial incentives or subsidy incentives in the right direction, that's when you actually see actors move in a direction. So, and we see that time and time again. So it's not because we work in support of policy that I say that. It's because we follow with metrics and data and observations what the impact is of clear policy directions and clear economic incentives. So I think that's where the idea should go. At the European level, if you want to change things in cities and in regions, well, a big part of the European budget is distributed through DG Regio. Yeah, strengthening the sustainability criteria, making the link with biodiversity and climate there are clear instruments that you can use, and you will see things shift. And then at a local level, it's of course also the health and well-being that is a clear sales pitch for a local mayor and a local political leaders. But Chris, if you allow me, I think the question you asked about the young people and you referred to Nadine, I think is absolutely critical. Yeah, and let me frame it in this way. In 1992, and I'm so glad Nadine mentioned the Rio summit. Actually, we had SDGs already. You know, it was called Agenda 21, an agenda for the 21st century. And if you look at how little we did with that, and we now promise that by 2030, how much we will do. I mean, the key question becomes, what will we be doing radically different in the next 10 years, which apparently we haven't done in the previous 28 years. And I think that is where, indeed, if you look at the objectives of the Green Deal, of the biodiversity strategy, we need to understand that this will require systemic ambitions with systemic level changes, understanding, as Matthias says, that the food system is broke, but also other parts of our economic system are not pointing in the right direction, and having the courage of really shifting the needle on the compass, the needle in investments. That's where I think the real hope for Nadine has to be. And it's not about future generations, it's about this generation. Yeah. If you're born today in Europe, you're alive in 2100. I can tell you from a scientific perspective, if we don't turn things around, 2100 is not a happy planet. Yeah, so we have to do it now. It's this generation today. We need to make the changes.
Hashtag EU Green Week. We have to do it now, says Hans. Can I go over back to Matthias? Małgorzata Matkowska asks, how do big companies like Danone implement sustainability while relying on industrial production at the same time?
This is a very good question, but in a way, we want to be, and we are, not a multinational company, but a multi-local company. Because 80% of what we sell in a country is produced in that country, which means that all the food supply chain, all the production system
is local.
And this is really, really important. This is really critical because in the wake of this current COVID crisis, the question of localization was very, very high and very critical. And in a way, at Danone, we have anticipated this topic because we do think and we want to depend on local production. This is key, and this is the reason why we are saying that Danone is not a multinational, but a multi-local company, and we have proof point about that on the ground.
Okay, all right. So for Danone, but what other companies do have global supply chains? How do they deal with that? Are you saying that they should go in that direction of local? And that would help to promote biodiversity.
It depends on your field of activity. I don't want to give lessons to other companies, but definitely, especially in the new with COVID world, I do think that the local approach is really, really important. If you want to have food sovereignty, but also maybe health sovereignty or other sovereignties like that, it's really, really critical to address such a challenge.
A question for Hans from Alyssa Jade McDonald Bertel. What role do you see research institutes in contributing to systemic change, which you have spoken of? How do you envisage partnerships working between policy, evidence, and action? I mean, I'm sure there are probably many times when you feel you're coming forth with these studies, but is anybody paying attention in the halls of power?
Yes, of course they do. That's why we work. That's why we work together well with our partners at the European level in the Commission, but also with a lot of partners in the countries. But it's a serious question. I think Europe, in particular, has been the major investor in research in climate and in biodiversity and in material science for circular economy. And I mean, in this scientific understanding in the right direction. It also has the JRC, which is a critical partner in this type of knowledge production. But then there needs to be the right investment in framing this in policy terms. And I always say policymakers don't think in micrograms and ppms. They don't think in taxa. They think in societal terms. So we need to translate this, bring it in the right frame, the right shape, to the right people at the right moment. And that requires some specialization, which is why I think that organizations like ourselves, where we do fact-based with a connection on the one hand to science, the latest knowledge, but also with a strong understanding of how policy works, that is a specific role and a niche that we fill. And you do it by I think bringing clear messages, by linking it to the sort of specific capacities, but also mandate that politicians have, or business leaders have, or NGO leaders have, and then having what we call actionable knowledge. You know, just talking about the situation is not good and it's all gloom and doom, that is not going to motivate people. So actionable knowledge, this is where the pressure points are, this is what you can do, this is where we know it works. That's where I think we can really link up.
And you can assure us that EU state of nature that you're going to be talking about in the next session, that's what it's going to do. Not only the gloom and doom, but also the solutions.
Yeah, there is a lot of links with where the pressure points are and where we have to work to turn things around, of course.
So I'm anxious to watch that. Florica, please.
Yeah, just to come in, I mean, you have seen that's almost like a tandem here now. But I mean, what Europe has really invested in, and also the Commission, is in creating really that knowledge base. And we are much more now policy driven by science. And that's why agencies like the Environmental Agency, but also the Chemical Agency or the Food Security Safety Agency were created. And they are tasked by us in order to provide exactly that type of data, which we then have to put into what we call in our jargon an impact assessment. But we do have to evaluate first what would be the impacts, including on environment or societal and other implications. And I think this is one of the reasons why we could come forward with things like the biodiversity strategy. Now, when we go further, we will have to come up with restoration targets. This will not be an easy issue. Politically, it's a very hot potato, but at the same time, we now do know, we have said in the biodiversity strategy, we will go and ask, and this is what we also now put forward in Council conclusions, and member states hopefully will follow on that, to enlarge the size of the protected areas, right? And for that, we then would like to go for restoration targets as well, and also to define what type of activities are allowed and what not. And they are allowed, but indeed, and again, do no harm, do no significant harm will come in. This is a conversation we will have with member states. It's a participatory conversation and a dialogue. But this is exactly the one that takes us forward. We cannot just impose. In any case, we can only propose, but we can't impose. It is the member states who have to translate it. But if we take them along with the right data and starting to measure from the right baseline, at least it gives a informed decision-making, and that's exactly what we are trying.
Wouldn't that be nice if all governments in the world followed the science? But that's not always the case.
On that.
We have another question, Christina Lillistic. We need food on our table, okay. The new Common Agricultural Policy, which is being voted on by the Parliament this week, so pay attention, needs to be a solution, not the problem for the environment. No sector is more connected to nature than agriculture. Nadine, you want to weigh in on that? About that, I'm not expecting you to go into the details of the Common Agricultural Policy, but I might mention that Frans Timmermans, the Executive Vice President of the European Commission, I talked with him during Farm to Fork last week, and he said the CAP could either go in the direction of helping biodiversity or in the other direction, helping to hurt it. So what do you think?
I believe that science provides us with the answers of what's the right decision regarding the cap. There's nothing else that I'd like to add to that in regards to the cap. I think it's clear for all of us. But I would like to say that apart from the science and knowing the science, I believe that it's also important to feel the nature and not just see the science behind and the numbers behind it. So I believe that it's vital for leaders, for the decision makers in CAP to have nature always in the backs of their heads, in the way they communicate, in the way they organize themselves, in the way they make decisions. So let's really feel what's going on there. For example, in the beehive, for example, Matthias, you have 100,000 employees, as far as I know. That's way more than in a beehive. Have you ever seen what's going on in a bee colony from close by? Did you ever have the chance to experience that? Yes, it's fascinating, isn't it? And the beehive can teach us so much about how we can work together and live together, and how to live in a healthier way as well. So let's consider that if we take the wrong decisions now with regards to the cap, we lose some of these species that can teach us so much. This is just something that I'd like to keep the decision makers in the backs of their heads when they're going to decide the cap.
Not to forget the bees. We have...
Can I jump in, Chris?
Yes, please, but briefly, we've got less than 10 minutes, so go ahead.
Can I?
Please.
Yeah, so I just want to point to two very important elements of the cap that are going to be decided tonight when the vote happens, and just call to all the MEPs to make sure that they vote with their conscience, because the proposal of the Commission was very, very good at setting up the requirements for farmers to receive direct payments or hectare-based payments, and leaving really important space for nature so we can get this regenerative agriculture that Matthias and others have been talking about, so we can actually protect the peatlands, not maintain the peatlands, protect the peatlands. We have to protect peatlands right now. And all of those things are being watered down right now by the proposal that is at the vote tonight. So this is the moment when Europe can show leadership. This is the moment when the ambition of the Green Deal, the ambition of the biodiversity strategy, with the ambition of the farm to fork strategy can really become reality if we really vote for a CAP reform that is going to help us advance those ambitions. If we vote with business as usual, with watering down the measures, with not putting the right amount of money into the schemes that are going to regenerate and restore nature, then all of our ambitions, all of the fantastic leadership that Europe has been showing with the Green Deal, with the biodiversity strategy, will go to waste. So it is now or never. It is today, when the vote happens, that we have to make sure that these commitments and the good proposals that the Commission has put forward are really becoming reality.
I think we need a tweet on the hashtag EU Green Week. Definitely. Did somebody else want to add something there? Matthias,
can I jump in?
Please.
Yeah, about the new common agricultural policy, I think that there is something that is really instrumental, is to promote carbon sequestration in soils. We have the tools. We know that during the COP21, the 4 per 1,000 initiative was launched. We do know that we can measure carbon in soils, for instance, and the common agricultural policy should be the right lever to subsidize and to incentivize such practices, because we can measure, and if we can measure, we can implement a new policy about that. This is very key to tackle climate change.
And are you ready to send some of your staff to the beekeepers team building events? Because I think it sounds very interesting.
Offline we can obviously we can share, because I'm really interested by Chris.
Did I hear Hans say something there? No?
Yeah, Chris, I think the question started by talking about food, and then we ended up with the cap. And the cap is, of course, important. But I think the food system approach is the really essential approach. By narrowing down the debate to the debate about farmers, I mean, we often point the finger at farmers, but they are stuck between a rock and a hard place, between the agrochemical input industries on the one hand, and on the other hand, the big food concerns. Yeah. And then in the chain, we also have the choices that we make. And to put it really simple, you could say that we pay for our food 4 times. Yeah. We pay when we buy the food in the store. We pay a second time because we need to subsidize the farmers, which is, if you think of it, a really bizarre economic fact. The people who produce the most fundamental thing in life, our food, we need to subsidize them because they don't make a decent living in many places. We pay a third time for the environment and climate consequences, and we pay a fourth time when we go to the doctor because we've got the safest food in Europe, arguably,
Yeah, so why don't we
but
pay
not
just
necessarily necessarily the healthiest food habits. There must be a better way to deal with food in the 21st century,
So-
and agriculture is part of it, but is only one part of that whole food chain.
The externalities of should be reflected in the actual price. Another question, I've got a few more, but try to get to as many as I can before the time's out. Iris in Corfu is asking, what do you mean by restoration? How can you restore something that is no longer there? Nadine, Patricia, one of you? Go, Nadine, go ahead. Nadine.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Nadine.
Oh, okay, my turn first. Well, I still see it around me, the nature, the biodiversity. Of course, it's not all doom and gloom. So I hear some frustration in that question, which I also share a lot of times. So what can we do? Should we all just retrieve ourselves from the problem now and only be sad about the loss that we and nature have already experienced, or do we stand up together right now and save what's left? And I think that is what we should focus on.
Well, that's a good point. Patricia, a couple more words on that?
Just a word of hope, because as I said before, there are so many examples of conservation and restoration programs that have worked. We just need to bring them up, scale them up, and change the world with that. I mean, it has happened. We have shown. I mean, the Natura 2000 is a fantastic example of that. The nature directives have managed to maintain somehow the nature of Europe. Now we need to make sure that we scale it up and implement it properly, so we can ensure that we can bring it together and not lose more. I think it is hanging on to what we have, as Nadine said, but also remember that nature is incredibly generous, and then when we give it a chance, it always comes back. And that if we want to be healthy, we need a healthy environment.
I would like to add very quickly, if I may,
Sure.
That what I take away, or as often is being talked about the biodiversity loss, is that it sounds as if it was a burden for us to take care of these things, that if it was a burden for us to regenerate and protect nature, of course, it can get a burden very quickly. But to be honest, for me, it's really fun to engage with nature. It's for me the most interesting and fascinating thing that I could do, to get into the beekeeping and combine it with some analytical skills. And to go into nature and work with nature, that's actually a really beautiful thing. But it works only as something positive and something that works and gives us joy if, of course, we have the resources to do so, and not do it next to a full-time job or in an unpaid internship, in a volunteering that we even have to pay for to do it. So it can be a really positive thing and not just a burden. There's a lot of potential in there.
Okay, I've got just a few minutes left. Another question from Małgorzata in Poland. Someone asking on social media, that was Małgorzata, isn't it more important to tackle climate change first and then deal with biodiversity? Hans, what do you think?
It's interesting.
Deal with climate change first and then biodiversity.
It's the same.
No, the simple answer is no, and I would add the third element to that, and that is the way in which we deal with materials and resources. The three are interconnected. If we fail on climate, we will fail on biodiversity. If we fail on resources, we will fail on biodiversity and climate. I mean, they are so interconnected. They are all part of the same system that sustains our societies. So we need to tackle them together.
Anybody with a quick final comment before we wrap it up?
So the way that I would put it is that climate and the climate change and biodiversity laws are the two sides of one single coin. We have to look at it as the coin. It has to be resolved together. So when we're talking about depleted soils, we're not talking about carbon being lost, we're talking about nature being lost. And when we talk about restoring nature, we're not talking about only restoring biodiversity, we're talking about stabilizing climate. It's the two sides of the same coin, and we have to tackle them together.
I think that's why we have a Green Deal that connects everything all together. It's, I think that seems like we have to deal with everything at the same time. Matthias, final word? Are you there?
From a business standpoint, I would say be a collective, be sustainable, or be irrelevant.
Very well said. Very well said.
Well done.
Okay, hang on, panel. I think, Florica, any final comments that you would like to make? What's the takeaway here? The thing is that we got to show that this discussion was just the beginning of these 3 days, and this sets the tone for all these lively discussions about all kinds of other issues that we're going to be dealing with during Green Week and that are connected to the Green Deal, right?
Yes, thank you, because we really consider it even as a stepping stone for us, this Green Week, in order to reach and to implement the biodiversity strategy. So, I mean, this is really a stepping stone among others. I think what I take away from this first discussion is definitely that we all understood that biodiversity, and I'm sorry I come back also to, there's no contradiction between biodiversity and climate change. It is intrinsically linked.
Yeah.
And as we have just heard also, I mean, some of the biggest carbon sink potential is by forest, lands, wetlands, peatlands, and so on and so on. So also agricultural land. So we definitely have to keep that, and that really minimizes and helps us also to reach climate neutrality if we were to restore and to preserve. So, but what I take away from this is the importance for society, for economy, but also for the health and for the healthy planet, of course, of each and everybody, if we really invest and treat biodiversity with the seriousness as it deserves.
Because a lot this has to do with jobs too. This has to do with
Economy, I said.
a just transition where we're going to come out with more jobs, not less, right?
Well, future-proof and transformative jobs. I mean, it's about being competitive, sustainable, actually on the long run, but in a just way. I mean, it's not about depletion of what we have, but preserving. But somebody had asked the question very clearly on, but can we ever go back on restoration? Everything is lost already.
Yeah.
Can I just say a last word? Because we talked about a lot of agriculture. Nobody mentioned fishery. I mean, for instance, if you would go on fishery and you give time for the fish to restore, doesn't mean that you cannot fish anymore, but you just have to preserve certain time. It will restore itself. I mean, so restoration targets do make sense and are possible. So I would end with a positive message.
I think there was one of the questions we didn't get to was, shouldn't this be called a Green-Blue Week?
Potentially.
Let's just mention the Natura Awards, Natura 2000. Yesterday, right?
No, we had it last week.
Last week. But I mean, some of the winners, these projects, protecting old growth forests in Bulgaria, safer roads in the Carpathians, better boating practices on the French coast. They all seem like little tiny steps, but they all mean something very important, right?
Well, you mentioned now some of the finalists and the winners, and I would just mention perhaps everybody who now contributes throughout, the whole year, not just in the Natura 2000 awards, for the Natura 2000 network, for us is very inspiring, because they put a lot of energy, a lot of resources, but also ideas in it. And by the awards, we have seen that there are great ideas which can be scalable. And
to
also
other parts of Europe.
Scalable either to other nations, to other member states,
right,
or scalable in their own way. I mean, you mentioned some on products, but a lot can be scaled, and that is again what we need as perhaps even as piloting some of the ideas which we then put into investment plans. And others are very local, and this is exactly what we also need, because we need to get the people along. So now I wanted to really rather use
Yes.
this now to thank everybody who
Let's
is
do.
contributing throughout years already to the Natura 2000 network, which is a big achievement for us.
And I think this was a good start for Green Week. Let's have some more conversations like this over the next few days about so many issues. Let me call your attention to, we'll take a break for about a half an hour until 1600 CET. And then there will be the 2020 State of Nature report by the European Environmental Agency that Hans runs. As he said, it won't be all gloom and doom. There will be solutions. Kind of reminds me of the new David Attenborough film, which shows a lot of despair and yet
But also
a lot of hope. And we hope to hear a lot of that from that report. Thanks for joining us. And please do continue to hashtag EU Green Week, hashtag EU Green Deal, too. And we'll see you again soon.